The hollow radio follows Tom Harper, a grieving man who begins hearing his late wife's voice whispering through the static of an old radio. At first it feels like hope, but the messages grow darker, warning of something coming. Drawn deeper into forbidden frequencies, Tom uncovers the town's hidden tragedies and a sinister force feeding on sorrow. The more he listens, the stronger the presence becomes, twisting his grief into terror. Is Claire truly calling from beyond, or is it a trap? A chilling tale of loss, obsession, and the deadly cost of listening too closely. The night had settled over the town like a thick, suffocating blanket. In his small, cluttered living room, Tom Harper sat hunched over an old, battered radio, the only source of light a dim amber glow from its dials. The air was heavy and still, save for the low hum of the device that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Outside, the world was swallowed by darkness and fog, the street lamps casting trembling shadows that merged with the creeping silence. Tom's fingers trembled as they moved over the radio's controls, adjusting the frequency in a desperate attempt to find anything that might break through the endless static. Weeks had passed since Claire's death, and the emptiness she left behind weighed on Tom like a relentless tide. The house felt hollow, every corner whispering memories that stabbed at his heart. He had become a ghost himself, wandering through the rooms, talking to shadows, searching for a connection that no longer existed. His nights were restless, haunted by dreams where Claire's voice was just out of reach, a fragile thread he couldn't grasp. Tonight, as the static crackled and hissed, something different stirred. Amid the white noise, a faint voice emerged, soft, trembling, and achingly familiar. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, eyes straining in the dim light, heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was broken, fragmented by the interference, but the tenderness, the unmistakable cadence, pulled at something deep within him. "Tom, beware, it's coming." The words were barely audible, swallowed by bursts of static, but the meaning was clear. It was Claire. Tears pricked at the corners of Tom's eyes as a surge of hope and terror collided inside him. Was it really her, or some cruel trick of his grief-addled mind? The voice faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the relentless crackle of the radio. Unable to tear himself away, Tom adjusted the dial again, chasing the elusive sound. The voices tangled together, whispers, laments, and warnings from other unseen presences, layered beneath the static like a chorus of lost souls. The weight of their sorrow pressed against his chest, each fragment a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and death. In the silence of the room, the radio's glow reflected in the window pane, casting Tom's pale, drawn face back at him like a specter. The room felt colder now, as if the very air had thickened with unseen presence. The voices seemed to reach out, threading through the static to touch the raw wound of his heart. As the night deepened, Tom sat motionless, caught between despair and a desperate hope. Claire's fragmented warning echoed in his mind, a chilling promise that something dark was coming, something that threatened to shatter the fragile veil between worlds. The radio, once a relic of his past life as a technician, had become a conduit to the unknown, drawing him into shadows that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the living. He knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and resolute, that his life had changed forever. The static whispers were no accident. They were a call, a summons to confront the grief and darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the townland within himself. Tom's fingers tightened around the radio's cold casing, the words of Claire's warning burning in his thoughts. He would listen, he would seek answers, and whatever came next, he would not turn away. The night outside stretched on, silent but for the crackling voices that haunted the airwaves, pulling Tom deeper into the mystery and into the heart of his own sorrow. And so, the first threads of a terrifying journey wove themselves in the dark, where grief met the unknown, and the static whispered secrets that threatened to unravel everything Tom held dear. But as the radio fell silent again, the question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Was it truly Claire's voice he had heard, or something far more sinister? The answer, Tom knew, was out there somewhere in the static between worlds. He would find it, or be consumed by the search. The static was a constant companion now, a low, unyielding hum that filled the corners of my small living room like a second heartbeat. It was always there, a murmur beneath the silence, a reminder of the voices that danced just beyond reach. Every evening after work, I sank into the worn armchair by the window. The radio perched precariously on the side table, its antenna stretched out like a fragile limb seeking connection. It was during one of these restless nights that I first heard it, clearly not just the indecipherable crackle or the fleeting fragments of speech, but Claire's voice, faint, fragmented by static, but unmistakably hers. The words were broken, a warning whispered through the haze, but they stirred something inside me that I hadn't felt since her passing, a desperate hope. I clung to those fleeting moments as if they were lifelines thrown across the vast gulf of loss. But with hope came an unbearable ache. Memories flooded in unbidden Claire's laughter echoing down our sunlit hallway. The soft brush of her hand against my cheek, the way her eyes sparkled when she was caught in a moment of joy. Those moments were sharp and cruel in their absence, cutting through the fog of grief with their vividness. I found myself reaching out to the empty air, talking into the silence as if she might answer. The obsession took hold swiftly. Each day, I fiddled with the radio dials, chasing the ghostly echoes that might carry her voice. My nights were restless, filled with the low drone of static and the half-heard warnings that sent shivers down my spine. The town itself seemed to hum with the same restless energy, whispers of loss and longing woven into the fabric of its streets. It was Margaret Lane who first brought a semblance of grounding to my unraveling world. The local librarian, sharp-eyed and calm, she listened with a mixture of skepticism and compassion when I confessed what I'd been hearing. At first, she dismissed my tales as grief-stricken fantasies, but the earnestness in my voice, the desperation that clung to every word, softened her resolve. Together, we began to sift through the town's history, poring over yellowed newspapers and brittle records that smelled of dust and forgotten time. The silence in the library was profound, broken only by the soft rustle of pages and the distant ticking of an old clock. Each discovery seemed to peel back another layer of the town's hidden wounds, tragedies buried beneath the surface. Unexplained disappearances, whispers of strange occurrences tied to the very phenomenon that now consumed me. Margaret's presence was a strange comfort, a tether to reality as my own mind threatened to slip into the void. She was patient, asking the right questions, challenging my assumptions without dismissing the truth I clung to. Her skepticism was a balm and a challenge. It forced me to confront the possibility that I was not alone in this other lives. Other stories were interwoven with mine in a tapestry of grief and fear. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows of the library, I shared with Margaret the fractured voices I'd heard, the warnings, the pleas, Claire's voice cutting through the static with an urgency that made my heart pound. Her eyes softened, a mixture of concern and dawning belief reflecting back at me. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on my arm, grounding me in a moment suspended between doubt and hope. The more we uncovered, the more I felt the weight of the town's collective sorrow pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. The radios weren't just picking up random interference, they were resonating with something far darker, something ancient awakened by the grief that hung heavy in the air. At times, the line between memory and reality blurred. I would catch myself staring into the empty room, hearing Claire's laughter ripple through the silence or feeling the brush of her hand on my skin. Those moments were both a balm and a torment, reminding me of what was lost and what might still be reached. As night settled over the town, the static on the radio grew louder, more insistent. I adjusted the dial again, hands trembling, straining to catch another glimpse of the past, another whisper of a voice that refused to be silenced. The room seemed to close in around me, filled with the ghosts of memories and the haunting promise of warnings yet to come. With Margaret by my side, I felt a fragile hope flicker amidst the darkness. But the shadows were lengthening, and the voices fractured, urgent, warned of a darkness approaching, one that would test the fragile boundaries of our world and my own resolve. The radios were not just a window to the past. They were a doorway to something far more sinister, and I was caught on the threshold, desperate to protect what little light remained. The night deepened, and with it, the whispers grew louder. I sat alone, the glow of the radio flickering like a beacon in the dark, waiting for the next message from beyond the veil. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I could not turn away. Claire's voice was my anchor, and through the static, I would listen no matter the cost. The echoes of loss were all around me, but so too was a fragile thread of hope. And in that precarious balance lay the story of a town haunted, a man broken and searching, and a warning that would not be ignored. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy curtains of Tom's living room, casting long, pale shadows across a scattering of radio parts and tangled wires strewn across the table. The static that had become a constant companion in his life buzzed softly from the vintage radio perched precariously on the edge of the cluttered surface. The voices, always there, always fractured and elusive, had begun to take a shape that his heart recognized, a shape that once was Claire. But today, Tom knew he had to do more than listen in isolation. The voices were no longer just his haunted solace. They were a mystery that needed unraveling. If the radios truly carried whispers from beyond, if Claire's voice was a warning and not a trick of his grief, then understanding the mechanism was crucial. And for that, he needed someone who knew the world of waves and static better than he did. Eli Jacobs was the obvious choice. The local radio host, a wiry man with a perpetually skeptical gaze, had dismissed the broadcasts at first. To Eli, it was just interference, a quirk of aging equipment and atmospheric conditions. But Tom hoped that beneath that skepticism lay the knowledge he needed. The radio station was tucked away in a corner of town, a small brick building humming with the pulse of transmission equipment. The moment Tom stepped inside, the air thickened with the scent of solder, paper, and an undercurrent of ozone. Flickering dials and blinking lights surrounded him, casting sharp contrasts of light and shadow that made the place feel alive, almost breathing. Eli looked up from a bank of consoles, his baseball cap tilted slightly back, exposing a furrowed brow. "Tom Harper," he said, voice rough but warm. "I didn't expect you here so early." "I need your help," Tom said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Something's wrong with the radios. Voices from the dead." Eli snorted softly, shaking his head. "You and your ghosts. It's all static, interference, that's all." Tom's eyes didn't waver. "Listen." He turned the dial, and the room filled with the familiar hiss of static. Then, beneath the crackling white noise, a faint, broken voice emerged, soft, trembling, but unmistakably Claire's. "Tom, it's coming." Eli's expression shifted, disbelief mingling with something like dread. For a long moment, he said nothing, just listened. The voice dissolved back into static. "Okay," Eli said finally. "That's something." Encouraged, Tom and Eli plunged into the technical details. Eli explained the intricacies of frequency modulation, signal interference, and the quirks of the town's aging radio towers. Together, they mapped patterns in the broadcasts, noting how the voices flickered in and out across various bands, as if slipping between frequencies like ghosts between worlds. Their late-night sessions became routine. The glow of dials and meters illuminated their determined faces as they chased fragments of Claire's voice through the chaotic radio waves. Eli's skepticism softened into cautious intrigue, his technical mind wrestling to explain the unexplainable. Meanwhile, Tom's neighbor Sarah Collins approached him one afternoon, clutching a battered radio receiver like a talisman. Her eyes were wide, shadowed with fear. "I hear them too," she whispered, voice trembling. "Voices at night, whispering. Sometimes they sound like warnings." Tom listened as Sarah recounted her experiences, how the voices came unbidden, how they echoed her own grief, how they seemed to seep into her dreams. Her story mirrored his own haunting, a shared thread of loss stretching through the town's quiet streets. Together, they formed an uneasy circle of the afflicted, bound by static and sorrow. The broadcasts were no longer Tom's isolated nightmare. They were a communal echo of something far larger and darker. As the days passed, the voices grew more insistent, more fragmented, Claire's warnings sharper, more urgent. Tom's obsession deepened, fueled by the growing evidence and the shared experiences of others. But with each new revelation, the boundary between reality and nightmare weakened, and the static whispered darker things in the spaces between words. Late one evening, as a storm rolled in and thunder rumbled like the growl of some ancient beast, Tom and Eli huddled over the consoles. The radio crackled violently, voices overlapping in a cacophony of grief and warning. Amid the chaos, Claire's voice pierced through, clear and commanding. "Prepare. It comes for us all." The room fell silent, save for the hum of the machines. Tom felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. The mystery was no longer distant or abstract, it was here, imminent and terrifyingly real. And in that silence, the static seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, waiting, watching. Tom knew this was only the beginning. The night deepened outside, but inside the radio station, the fragile line between the living and the dead grew thinner with every passing moment. The voices in the static were not mere echoes, they were warnings, calls to arms against an encroaching darkness that fed on grief and fear. Tom's journey had taken him beyond his personal sorrow into a realm where memory and reality tangled, where the radios served as conduits to a world unseen. And as he leaned closer to the dials, listening for another fragment of Claire's voice, he understood that to fight what was coming, he needed to confront not only the spectral transmissions, but the shadows within himself. The static whispered on, and Tom Harper was ready to listen. The library was quieter than usual that afternoon. The usual hum of whispered conversations and rustling pages replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against the walls like the weight of the secrets hidden within. Margaret Lane sat hunched over a battered wooden table in the archive room, the dim glow of a single desk lamp illuminating the yellowed pages of old newspapers and brittle diaries spread out before her. Her sharp eyes scanned the faded text with growing unease. Each article and entry told a story not unlike the one unfolding now, a stretch of years marked by mysterious disappearances, strange sounds on radios, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear. "Look at this," Margaret said, her voice low but steady as she tapped a newspaper clipping. Here, from 1947, there was a string of disappearances. All clustered around the same time, strange radio interference was reported across the town. People heard voices, faint and disjointed, much like what you described. Tom leaned in, his pale face framed by a tangled mop of hair, eyes wide yet haunted. The cluttered living room of his house seemed worlds away from the musty, paper-scented stillness of the library, but the connection was undeniable. "It's always been here," he murmured, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the old radio perched on his workbench. Static hissed through the speakers, voices swirling just beyond comprehension. "I don't think this is just some coincidence," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's been feeding off the grief here for decades." Margaret nodded, her expression grave, "And it's growing stronger." Back at his home later that evening, Tom sat alone, the radio's soft crackle filling the room. The voices were fragmented, overlapping like a chorus of distant echoes, some mournful, others urgent. His fingers traced the dials absently, the static dancing at the edge of his hearing. A sudden chill crawled up his spine, and the hairs on the back of his neck prickled as an unsettling sensation took hold, the feeling of being watched, not by any living thing, but by something lurking in the shadows beyond perception. Memories of Claire flickered through his mind, her warm smile, the softness of her touch, the sound of her laughter. But these recollections soon twisted, merging with the disjointed voices on the radio, until he could no longer tell where memory ended and spectral interference began. The hollow presence was there, whispering through the static, weaving doubt and fear into the fabric of his thoughts. Days passed in a blur of research and restless nights. Margaret and Tom spent hours poring over the dusty archives, piecing together fragments of the town's dark history. The diary entries revealed a cycle of sorrow and disappearance, each tragedy feeding the entity that haunted the broadcasts. The more they uncovered, the heavier the weight upon Tom's shoulders grew. His once analytical mind was beginning to fray, obsession gnawing at his resolve. "We need to find a way to break the cycle," Margaret said one afternoon, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "If this force has been feeding on grief for so long, maybe it can be starved or banished." Tom shook his head, the lines of worry etched deeper into his face. "It's not just feeding, it's becoming stronger. I can feel it pulling at me, at all of us." That night, the boundary between worlds seemed thinner than ever. The radio buzzed with heightened static, voices rising in a chaotic crescendo. Tom's memories and the spectral warnings collided, a storm of sound and emotion that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Yet through the turmoil, Claire's voice emerged clearer than before, fragile, urgent, a tether to the light amidst the growing darkness. "Beware what comes," she warned, her voice fractured but unmistakable. "It feeds on our pain. Don't let it in." Tom's fists clenched around the radio's edge, determination flaring despite the fear and confusion. The hollow presence was no longer a distant shadow, it was here, entwined with the very air he breathed. And to protect the living, he would have to face it, even if it meant losing himself in the process. As the static swelled once more, the room seemed to close in, and the night stretched on, heavy with the promise of revelations yet to come. The signals from beyond were no longer just whispers, they were a call to arms, and Tom was listening. Tom Harper sat in his dimly lit living room, the only illumination coming from the flickering glow of the old radio perched precariously on the edge of his cluttered workbench. The static hissed and crackled like a swarm of restless bees, filling the air with a tense, almost electric charge. Tom's pale fingers trembled as he adjusted the dial minutely, seeking that elusive frequency where the voices lurked beneath the static's veil. The voices had grown louder over the past days, more insistent, more fragmented. Sometimes they whispered in unintelligible murmurs, like distant echoes from a forgotten dream, but there were moments when clarity broke through like shards of glass. And then there was Claire's voice, faint but unmistakable, shattered and fractured by static, yet undeniably hers. Tom, the sound was barely audible, a fragile thread weaving through the crackling interference. The single word sent a jolt through his chest, a mixture of hope and a stabbing pain he hadn't felt since her death. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the radio's glass face, straining to catch her next words. "It's coming, darkness. Don't let it in." The warning was fragmented, the static swallowing parts of her message, but the urgency was unmistakable. Tom's heart hammered wildly. Was it a hallucination? A cruel trick of his mind? Or was Claire reaching out to him from beyond the veil, desperate to warn him? The room felt colder suddenly, the shadows in the corners lengthening and deepening. Tom shivered, wrapping his arms around himself, fighting the rising tide of fear and grief that threatened to engulf him. Days earlier, he had confided in Margaret Lane, the local librarian and one of the few people willing to entertain his growing obsession without dismissing him outright. Together, they had spent hours combing through old archives, dusty newspapers, and faded photographs in the cavernous silence of the library. Margaret's sharp eyes and calm demeanor were a steadying force amid the storm of Tom's unraveling thoughts. "Look at this," Margaret said one afternoon, her finger tracing the yellowed pages of a century-old diary. "There have been similar incidents before, people hearing voices, strange broadcasts, disappearances. This town has a history of grief feeding something dark." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of their discovery sinking in. The radios weren't just picking up random interference or static, they were a conduit, a bridge between worlds. And the darkness Claire warned about was drawing nearer. Outside, the town seemed unchanged, but Tom sensed a shift. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken dread, a collective tension simmering beneath the surface. As dusk fell, he walked the quiet streets, the hum of radios from nearby houses blending with the whispering wind. It felt as if unseen eyes followed his every step, as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting. Back home, exhaustion clawed at his mind, but sleep eluded him. The radio static morphed into a piercing shriek, a sudden cacophony that made his hands jump. Then, through the chaos, Claire's voice fractured but urgent. "Tom, protect them, before it's too late." The message shattered the fragile barrier between sanity and madness. Tom gasped, clutching his head as a wave of panic crashed over him. Was this a desperate plea from beyond, or the despair of a broken mind conjuring ghosts to torment him? He sank to the floor, breath ragged, caught between hope and horror. The fractured frequencies whispered their dreadful secrets, and Tom knew there was no turning back. The darkness was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would test the limits of his grief, his courage, and his very soul. His fingers found the radio dial once more, the static swirling like a living thing. He tuned in, ready to listen, ready to fight though. The boundary between the living and the dead was growing thinner with every passing moment. Outside, the night deepened, and the town held its breath. The town hall was packed beyond its modest capacity, the air thick with unease and whispered speculation. Tom Harper sat near the back, shoulders hunched beneath his threadbare coat, eyes flicking nervously toward the front where a hastily arranged panel of town officials and concerned residents attempted to maintain order. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pallid, flickering glow that seemed to deepen the shadows pooling in corners and beneath tired eyes. Voices rose and fell in waves, some cautious, others outright accusatory. "It's the radios," a woman said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Those voices sit like they're reaching into our homes, into our minds. What are we supposed to do?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and frustration. Tom's gaze fixed on the faces around him, their expressions a mirror of his own turmoil. Grief, anxiety, suspicion. It was as if the entire town's sorrow had congealed into this palpable, suffocating cloud. Margaret Lane stood near the podium, her posture calm but alert. She raised a hand for silence, and the room gradually stilled. "We know that these broadcasts are more than mere interference," she began, voice steady though edged with concern. "Several of us have experienced strange phenomena, voices that seem aware, warnings that defy explanation. I've been digging through the town's archives, and I believe there's a history here we've overlooked." Tom's heart pounded. He had urged Margaret to pursue this line of inquiry ever since her initial skepticism had softened. Now, her words gave shape to the dread that had been gnawing at him in sleepless nights filled with static whispers. Later that evening, Tom found himself in the dim confines of the library's archive room. Dust motes swirled in the narrow beams of light cast by an old desk lamp. Margaret sat opposite him, her fingers tracing the spine of a worn, leather-bound diary. The musty scent of aged paper filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of the building's heating system. "This belonged to one of the town's earliest residents," Margaret said softly, opening the book to reveal delicate, yellowed pages crowded with tight, looping script. "Sarah Whitmore. She documented a series of strange events, voices on the radio. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, all dating back almost a century." Tom leaned in, eyes scanning the fragile text. The entries were unsettling, descriptions of voices speaking through static, warnings of an encroaching darkness, and a desperate plea to remember the past, lest it consume the present. Each page seemed to throb with a silent echo of sorrow, a resonance that stirred something deep within Tom's own grief. "It's like the hollow presence has been here all along," Tom murmured, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "Feeding on the town's pain, growing stronger with every loss." Margaret nodded, her gaze grave. "And every time it rises, the cycle repeats. We need to understand it if we're to break free." Meanwhile, Eli Jacobs sat behind the soundboard at the local radio station, the stale air thick with the scent of coffee and worn electronics. His fingers hovered over the controls, adjusting dials as static crackled through the speakers. That familiar sneer of skepticism he wore in public was tempered now by a flicker of unease. The interference was no longer just background noise. It had a rhythm, a pattern that defied logical explanation. "Tom," Eli said during a late-night call, voice low and serious, "I don't know what's going on, but this isn't normal. The signal's there, almost like messages. Something's trying to communicate." Tom's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. "I've been hearing Claire's voice," he confessed. "She's warning me. I'm starting to believe you," Eli admitted, the weight of his words hanging heavily between them. Days passed in a blur of research and restless nights. Tom and Margaret pored over newspapers, police reports, and the diary's haunting entries. The radio's static was a constant companion, a sinister soundtrack underscoring their efforts. At times, Claire's fractured voice slipped through the noise, a fragile lifeline tethering Tom to a reality he struggled to hold on to. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the library's windows, Tom whispered, "It's like the town itself is alive with grief. The hollow presence feeds on it, twisting memories and fears into something darker." Margaret's eyes met his, steady and resolute. "Then we have to be stronger. We have to fight back." But even as they resolved to act, the shadows lengthened both in the town and within Tom's heart. The resonance of past sorrows echoed louder, threatening to drown out the fragile hope they clung to. The chapter closes with Tom standing alone outside the library, the diary clutched tightly in his hands. The night air is thick with the scent of rain and static, carrying with it a whisper of warning that chills him to the bone. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackles to life, and Claire's voice, faint but unmistakable, cuts through the silence. "He's coming." Tom's breath catches. The battle was only just beginning. The room was drowned in static. It filled the corners, seeped into the walls, and wrapped itself tightly around Tom like a suffocating shroud. He sat, slumped in the chair by the window, the old radio perched on the battered table before him, crackling with an otherworldly noise that was more than mere interference. There was a pulsing cadence to it, almost like a heartbeat in ease, irregular, as if the static itself was alive and breathing. Tom's gaze was fixed on the radio's flickering dial, each twitch of its needle echoing the rhythm embedded in the white noise. His fingers trembled as they hovered near the tuning knob, reluctant to adjust for fear of losing the fragile thread that connected him to the spectral transmissions. And yet, the voices remained elusive, swallowed beneath layers of distortion and silence. Suddenly, the radio fell silent. The static vanished as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving a vacuum that pressed against Tom's lungs and made his breath shallow. The absence of sound was overwhelming an oppressive quiet that filled the room with a weight far heavier than the noise before it. His skin prickled, a chill crawling up his spine as if the silence itself was a presence, watching and waiting. He swallowed hard, eyes darting around the shadowed corners of the living room as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing, only the heavy stillness that seemed to throb with a sinister energy. In that moment, the boundary between the living and dead felt perilously thin, as if the hollow presence was testing its limits, probing for weakness. Tom's mind wavered, memories flickering erratically, like broken film reels caught in a malfunctioning projector. Claire's voice, once a soothing balm, warped into something chilling and distorted. Her warmth twisted into urgent whispers that clawed at his heart. Fragments of warnings and pleas tangled with static that hissed and crackled like a storm. He shut his eyes tightly, willing the images away, but the haunting chorus persisted. The memories blended with hallucinations, the scent of her hair, the touch of her hand, the sound of her laughter, all slipping through his grasp like smoke. Grief and fear intertwined, knitting a web from which he struggled to break free. Desperate for grounding, Tom reached for his phone and dialed Margaret. The line connected with a faint crackle, and her calm voice answered, steady as ever, despite the turmoil swirling within him. "Tom, are you all right? You sound distant." He took a ragged breath, struggling to find words. "It's the radio, the static, it's different now. It's like it's alive, Margaret. I can feel it twisting my memories, warping everything. I don't know what's real anymore." There was a pause, then she replied, "You're not alone in this. I've been digging through the archives. There's more to this town's history than you realize, tragedies linked to these broadcasts. It's like the hollow presence feeds on our grief, twisting reality to gain power. You have to hold on, Tom. We need to understand it before it's too late." Her words were a fragile lifeline, an anchor in the storm of Tom's unraveling thoughts. Despite the overwhelming dread, a flicker of resolve ignited within him. He would not let this darkness consume him or the people he cared about. He would fight, no matter the cost. As the call ended, the radio crackled once more to life, the static intensifying into a roar that drowned out every other sound. Amid the chaos, a voice emerged, Claire's voice fragmented, but unmistakably hers, carrying a warning laced with urgency and sorrow. "Tom, it's coming. Protect them, protect yourself." The room seemed to pulse with the weight of her words, and the hollow presence made itself known not just as a force of grief, but as a predator lurking in the static shadows. Tom's hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. The battle ahead was no longer just about hearing the voices. It was about confronting the darkness that sought to unravel everything he held dear. The line between memory and nightmare blurred, but his determination remained steadfast. Outside, the night deepened, and the radio's static sang its hollow song. A siren call that beckoned the living and the dead toward an unknown fate, and Tom Harper would answer. The next morning, the town seemed deceptively normal. The sun filtered weakly through grey clouds, casting a muted light over streets that bore the marks of quiet desperation. Tom met Margaret at the library, her sharp eyes immediately noting the fatigue etched into his face. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, guiding him to a table piled with yellowed papers and brittle books. Tom sat heavily, rubbing his temples. The hollow presence sits stronger. I can feel it manipulating my memories, twisting Claire's voice into something I don't recognize. It's like it's trying to break me. Margaret nodded, her expression grave. The diaries I found mentioned similar experiences. People losing themselves, caught between reality and something else. The entity thrives on grief, feeding off the pain and confusion. She slid a worn notebook across the table. This belonged to a man from a century ago, who wrote about voices on the radio, though of course they had different means then. The pattern repeats. Tom flipped through the pages, the faded ink revealing tales of loss and madness, warnings echoing through time. It was as if the hollow presence was an ancient force, awakened by the sorrow that clung to the town like a second skin. "So how do we fight it?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated. "We don't know yet, but knowledge is our first weapon. We have to understand its nature, the source of its power. Then maybe we can find a way to sever the connection." The library's quiet was pierced by the sudden crackle of a radio from a nearby desk. Tom and Margaret exchanged a glance, the sound a reminder of the invisible war unfolding around them. Outside, whispers of static drifted on the wind, the hollow presence growing bolder, its shadow stretching ever wider. Tom's fight had only just begun. That evening, Tom returned home, the house feeling colder and emptier than before. He sat by the window, the radio humming softly beside him. The static was thicker now, almost tactile, as if the air itself was charged with unseen menace. He closed his eyes and listened, focusing on the fragmented voices within the noise. Claire's voice pierced through, clearer than ever, yet laced with an urgency that made his heart ache. "Listen, Tom. The boundary thins. The dark comes for the living. You must be strong." The words faded into the static, replaced by a sudden silence so complete it rang in his ears. Then came a low, rumbling sound, like something shifting deep beneath the earth, or a distant storm gathering force. Tom's breath caught. The hollow presence was not content to remain hidden in whispers. It was moving, growing, and it had set its sights on him. His fingers found the tuning knob, twisting it slowly as if trying to tune the darkness itself out. But the static only grew louder, a roaring tide threatening to engulf his mind. With a shuddering breath, Tom straightened. "I won't let you take everything," he whispered into the gathering night. "Not again." The radio crackled violently, a burst of white noise exploding through the silence. And beneath it all, Claire's voice, fragile but fierce. "Hold on, Tom. The fight is just beginning." Outside the window, shadows deepened, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The hollow presence was here, and Tom Harper was ready to face it. The static thickened once again, and Tom's world teetered on the edge of the known and the unfathomable. The fight for his mind, his memories, and his very soul was underway. The hollow presence was no longer a distant threat, it was a living shadow, a whisper in the dark, and a nightmare made real. And Tom Harper would not falter. The hall was packed, the air thick with a restless murmur that seemed to vibrate with static itself. Faces were drawn tight with fear and confusion, eyes darting nervously toward the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Tom sat near the back, clutching the small radio that had become his lifeline. Its incessant crackle a grim reminder of the thin veil between the living world and the realm beyond. Margaret stood at the front, her voice calm but edged with urgency as she recounted the disturbing patterns buried deep within the town's history. "These aren't isolated incidents," she said, gesturing to a faded map dotted with dates and names. "Disappearances, sudden deaths, strange broadcasts. They all seem to be part of something far older than any of us realized." Tom's mind was only half on the words. His thoughts flickered to Claire, her voice still echoing in his ears, urging him to uncover the truth before it was too late. The radio's static danced faintly, and for a moment he thought he heard her whisper, a soft but clear warning threading through the white noise. Suddenly, the room's atmosphere shifted. A man, seated near the center, his face pale and gaunt, began to tremble violently. His eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and his body convulsed with unnatural force. The murmurs erupted into panicked gasps as an unearthly voice, distorted and layered with static, surged from his lips. "They come, the veil thins. Beware." The man lunged forward, knocking over chairs and sending people scrambling. Tom leapt up, heart pounding, trying to calm the chaos, but the sense of dread was suffocating. The hollow presence had made itself known not just through whispers on the radio, but in flesh and bone. Outside, rain hammered down, a relentless rhythm against the pavement. Tom stood alone, the small radio warm in his hands, Claire's voice cutting through the storm's noise. "You must see beyond the shadows, Tom. Find what lies buried beneath the silence." Her words anchored him, even as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. He thought back to the diary Margaret had found, entries filled with sorrow and fear, chronicling a cycle of grief that fed the very entity now tearing at the seams of reality. That night, memories and present horrors collided. He saw Claire's gentle smile, felt her warmth, then the stark terror of losing her all over again. The line between worlds blurred, but his resolve hardened. He would face whatever lurked beyond the static, for her, for the town, for himself. The hollow presence was no longer just a voice in the static. It was a force growing stronger, and Tom was the last barrier standing between it and the living. He took a deep breath, the cold night air filling his lungs. The fight was just beginning. The town was quiet in the early morning hours, but Tom's mind refused to rest. The violent outburst from the meeting replayed endlessly behind his eyes. He paced the length of his small living room, the radio on the windowsill crackling softly with static. From within the noise, Claire's voice emerged, faint but unmistakable. "Remember the past, Tom. The diary holds the key." He reached for his coat. There was no time to waste. The boundary was thinning, and the longer he waited, the stronger the hollow presence became. He needed Margaret and Eli's help to unlock the secrets before the darkness consumed them all. As dawn broke, Tom stepped into the misty streets, the weight of grief and dread pressing heavily on his shoulders. But beneath it all, a stubborn spark of hope burned. He would find the truth. He had to. In the quiet sanctuary of the library, Margaret spread the ancient diary open across a heavy oak table. The pages were brittle, ink faded, but still legible. Together, they traced the names and dates, piecing together a tapestry of sorrow that spanned generations. Each tragedy seems to coincide with these strange radio signals, Margaret said, her fingers sliding down a page. The hollow presence feeds on grief, growing stronger with every loss. Tom nodded, his fingers trembling as he traced a familiar name, Claire. His chest tightened with a fresh wave of pain. But alongside the grief was clarity. Understanding this pattern was the first step toward breaking it. "We can stop it," he whispered, more to himself than to Margaret. "We have to." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of static, a reminder that the fight was far from over. Later that night, Tom lay in bed, shadows flickering across the walls as the storm raged outside. His thoughts swirled between memories and the present terror. Suddenly, a vivid flashback seized him, Claire's warm smile, the softness of her touch. Then the stark fear in her eyes as she whispered a warning he had never fully understood until now. The room seemed to pulse with the radio's faint hiss, the boundary between memory and reality dissolving. He reached out, as if to grasp something just beyond his fingertips, the line between worlds thinner than ever. "I'm here," Claire's voice echoed, steady and clear amid the chaos. "Hold on, Tom." And in that fragile moment, he found the strength to face the darkness ahead. The diary lay open on the battered wooden table, its pages yellowed and fragile, dust motes dancing in the weak afternoon light filtering through the library's grimy windows. Tom Harper sat beside Margaret Lane, their faces close together, eyes scanning the cramped, flowing script that chronicled decades of sorrow and strange happenings in their town. The room smelled faintly of old paper and must, mingled with the sharp tang of Tom's stale coffee. Margaret's finger traced the faded words, her voice low and steady as she read aloud. And again, the voices returned on the wind, a lament carried by the static that filled the nights. Families torn asunder, grief piling upon grief, the shadow growing with each farewell. Tom's gaze flicked to the radio perched on the shelf nearby. It was silent now, but earlier, the faintest of voices had seeped through fragments of warnings, echoes of Claire's voice, distorted yet unmistakable. His heart clenched painfully. "It's like history repeating itself," Margaret murmured, eyes darkening. The entries mentioned disappearances, sudden deaths, and a presence felt but unseen. Every time the grief in the town swells, so too does this entity. Tom swallowed hard, memories swirling like a storm in his mind. Claire's pale face, the hospital's sterile white walls, the helplessness clawing at his chest as her breath grew shallow. He'd told himself it was over, done. But now, the diary suggested otherwise. This was no random haunting. It was a curse, fed by the sorrow that gripped them all. He closed his eyes briefly, the room falling away as Claire's voice whispered through the static in his mind. "Tom, beware. It feeds on what you cannot let go." Margaret's voice brought him back. "There's more here," she said, flipping the page. "Listen to this. The hollow grows stronger with every tear shed, every silent prayer unanswered. To break the cycle, one must face the shadow and stop the mourning from consuming the living." Tom's fingers clenched into fists. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any grief. He had to act, but the fear of losing himself to the same darkness was overwhelming. That evening, alone in his dim living room, Tom sat with the radio crackling softly beside him. The voices came through again, layered, fragmented, a chorus of mourning that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. Among them, Claire's voice surfaced, tender and fractured, pulling him back to their last days together. "Remember the light," she urged, her tone urgent yet distant. His mind flooded with images of her frailty, the slow ebbing of life that no doctor could halt. The guilt of survival burned fiercely. Was his obsession with the voices a bridge or a trap? Days passed in a haze of research and restless nights. Margaret and Tom continued their work, uncovering entries that traced the entity's influence back through generations. Each tragedy echoed the last lost breeding loss, the hollow presence growing stronger with each broken heart. One late afternoon, Margaret read aloud a particularly harrowing passage. On the night the last light died, the town fell silent, but for the radio's mournful song, a dirge for souls lost and those yet to come. Her voice trembled, eyes flicking nervously to the window as shadows stretched longer. Tom felt a chill settle deep in his bones. The diary was more than history. It was a warning, a map of sorrow he had to navigate. That night, standing by his window, Tom looked out over the town cloaked in darkness. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint crackle of the radio. The voices whispered like ghosts in the wind, a painful reminder of what had been lost and what was at stake. He steeled himself, the ache in his chest mingling with a fragile hope. The cycle could be broken. He had to believe it. For Claire, for the town, for himself. But as the static swelled once more, carrying voices both familiar and unknown, Tom knew the path ahead would test the limits of his courage and sanity. The hollow presence was not yet done. His journey into the heart of grief and darkness was only just beginning. "Claire," Tom whispered into the silence, "I'm coming for you." The radio hummed in response, a faint crackle riding the edge of the night, and in that fragile moment, the line between the living and the dead blurred once again. The frequencies hummed louder than ever now, a chaotic storm of static and fragmented voices that seemed to claw at the edges of sanity. In the dim corners of his living room, Tom Harper sat surrounded by his arsenal of radios, each one a portal to the spectral voices that haunted the town. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the dials, desperate to isolate the faintest whisper of Claire's voice among the growing cacophony. The air was thick with a suffocating tension, as if the very atmosphere had been charged with unseen electricity. Outside, the town was unraveling. Reports flooded in, neighbors hearing faint cries and warnings through their radios. Strangers crossing the streets with haunted eyes, whispers spreading like wildfire in the cold night air. The collective paranoia was palpable. At the heart of it all, Tom felt the crushing weight of his obsession pressing down on him, threatening to consume the fragile threads that still connected him to the living. Eli Jacobs, once a dismissive voice on the local airwaves, had undergone a profound transformation. The skeptical glint in his eyes had been replaced by a resolute intensity. At the radio station, Eli meticulously flipped switches and scrutinized equipment, his every movement betraying a man preparing for battle against an enemy unseen but deeply felt. His voice, once light and mocking, now carried a steady reassurance as he worked alongside Tom to decipher the maddening transmissions. "It's like the static itself is alive," Eli remarked one evening, eyes fixed on the oscillating waves on the screen. "It's feeding off the fear, the grief. We need to be ready." Margaret Lane, the ever-steady librarian, had become a vital anchor in the storm. In the quiet sanctuary of the library, she sifted through brittle documents and faded photographs, her brow furrowed with concern. Tom recounted the recent surge in voices, the spreading dread that gripped their neighbors, and the mounting evidence of something ancient stirring beneath the town's surface. "This isn't just random interference," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a pattern, a cycle of grief and loss that seems to feed whatever this is." Sarah Collins, Tom's neighbor, had sought him out in the dead of night, her eyes wide with fear. Her voice trembled as she described the voices that haunted her dreams, the chilling warnings that seeped from her radio like a poison. "It's like they're trying to tell us something," she said, clutching her coat tightly. "But what?" The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and carrying an eerie chorus of static that seemed to echo from every corner of the town. The radios crackled violently, bursting with a sudden surge of energy that sent a ripple through the room. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. The hollow presence was growing stronger, its grip tightening like a noose. The boundary between the living and the dead was thinning, and the town teetered on the edge of an abyss. Yet amid the fear and chaos, a fragile hope flickered. Eli's unwavering resolve, Margaret's knowledge, Sarah's shared fear, and Tom's burning determination coalesced into a fragile alliance. They were no longer isolated victims of the haunting. They were a resistance, preparing to face the darkness head-on. But the question remained, could they confront the hollow presence before it consumed everything they held dear? As the night deepened and the static roared like a tempest, Tom adjusted the radio one final time. Through the dissonant waves, a familiar, fractured voice whispered his name. Claire's voice, clear and urgent, a beacon in the encroaching night. And with it came the chilling promise of confrontation, where past and present, life and death, would collide in a storm of fear and desperate hope. The battle was coming, and Tom Harper would have to face it alone or not at all. The night had fallen heavy and dark, the sky roiling with thick, angry clouds that blotted out the stars. I stood by the window, my breath fogging the glass as torrents of rain hammered the streets below. Thunder rolled like the growl of some ancient beast, shaking the very bones of the town. Inside my small living room, the radio sputtered and hissed, the static swelling with the storm's fury. Then, through the crackling interference, a voice broke, through a voice I thought I'd never hear again. Claire, her words were fragmented, broken by bursts of static, but unmistakable. "Tom, the boundary, it's breaking. Darkness comes." The urgency in her tone was a stark contrast to the gentle warmth I remembered. Every syllable struck me like a cold blade, cutting through the fog of grief that had long enveloped me. I gripped the windowsill, knuckles white, as the radio's volume seemed to swell in tandem with the storm outside. It was as if the tempest was a conductor, orchestrating the spectral symphony that now filled the airwaves. The many voices layered atop one another in a chaotic chorus of warnings and sorrow, rippling through the static like waves lashing against a crumbling shore. I wasn't alone in this ordeal. Earlier that evening, I had met with Margaret Lane in her cluttered study, the faint glow of a single lamp casting long shadows over piles of dusty books and yellowed papers. Between us lay the old diary, its fragile pages filled with hurried, trembling script that told stories of past tragedies eerily similar to our own. Each entry was a thread weaving into the tapestry of the town's dark history disappearances. Madness, grief feeding an unseen force. Margaret's calm demeanor belied the storm brewing in her eyes. "This isn't just coincidence," she said softly, tracing a finger along a passage. "The broadcasts, the disappearances, they're part of a cycle, Tom. And whatever it is feeding off our sorrow, it's growing stronger." Her words settled heavily in the room, mingling with the distant rumble of thunder. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility pressed down on me like the oppressive humidity outside. Later, at Eli's makeshift radio station, the atmosphere was tense, filled with the low hum of equipment and the occasional burst of static. Eli, once a skeptic, now wore the wary expression of a man who had glimpsed something beyond understanding. His hands trembled as he adjusted the dials, trying to stabilize the signal. The voices that poured through were no longer mere interference. They were urgent, pleading, fragmented cries from the other side. "This isn't just noise anymore," Eli muttered, eyes fixed on the oscillating waveforms. "It's a warning." Returning home, I sat alone, the storm's howl a constant backdrop to the voices swirling in my mind. The radio's buzz was relentless, but amidst the chaos, Claire's voice emerged again clearer, more insistent. "Prepare, Tom. The night will tear the veil apart. You must stand between worlds." Her words ignited a fragile spark of hope within me, mingled with the dread that threatened to consume what little sanity I had left. I knew the night ahead would be the crucible where past and present collided, where grief and fear would either shatter me or forge a weapon strong enough to hold back the encroaching darkness. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the storm's fury and the unseen force that prowled just beyond the veil. Tonight, I would face the hollow presence, no longer as a broken man haunted by memories, but as a guardian standing at the fragile boundary between life and death. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the roof. Inside, the radios blared their spectral warnings, a gathering storm of static and voices that blurred the line between worlds. And as the night deepened, so too did the shadows around me, whispering promises of terror and the hope that I might yet hold back the coming darkness. I reached for the radio once more, tuning the dials with trembling hands. "Claire," I whispered into the storm, "I'm listening." The voice that answered was faint, but resolute a beacon in the swirling tempest. "Hold fast, Tom. The night is coming." And with that, the gathering storm surged onward, carrying with it the fate of the town and of my own fragile soul. The storm outside had been gathering for hours, but now it unleashed its fury, thunder booming across the town like an angry god's wrath. I sat alone in the dim glow of my living room, the only light flickering from the old table lamp, its shade casting long, uneasy shadows on the walls. The radio, perched precariously on the edge of the battered wooden table, hissed and crackled with static, the eerie white noise filling the room like a living thing. Among the chaos of the static, a voice emerged, soft, fractured, unmistakably Claire's. "Tom, it's coming. You have to listen." Her words were faint, fragmented by interference, but the unmistakable warmth of her tone pierced through the distortion. My heart pounded violently, a mixture of dread and desperate hope flooding my chest. I reached out, hands trembling, fingers brushing the radio's knobs as I tried to stabilize the signal. Each adjustment brought her voice into sharper focus, then warped it again, as if the entity itself fought to keep her words lost in the noise. I leaned closer, whispering back to the static, "Claire, I'm here, I'm listening." Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped sharply. The air thickened, heavy with a suffocating presence that pressed against my skin like a wet shroud. The lights flickered violently, then all at once plunged into darkness. Only the radio's glow remained, casting an eerie blue light across my face. A deep silence followed, the kind that robs you of breath and sanity. Then, without warning, the static burst into a cacophony of shrieks and whispers, twisting and swirling around me. From that maelstrom, the hollow presence made itself known not in a shape, but in a weight, a distortion of sound and space, an oppressive force that bent reality itself. I staggered back, clutching my chest, the memories flooding me unbidden. Claire's smile, her laughter echoing in sunlit rooms, the softness of her touch, all these moments swirled with the terrifying now, blurring the lines between past and present. Her voice cut through the chaos again, steady and urgent. "Don't let it take you. Hold on to me, Tom." Desperation clawed at me. I forced myself to focus on her words, the fragile lifeline tethering me to sanity. The radio's volume crept higher, drowning out the entity's malevolent whispers, the static's biting cold. I could feel the presence pushing back, trying to fracture my resolve, to pull me into its endless void of grief and despair. Lightning illuminated the room in jagged bursts, revealing glimpses of the shadows that writhed along the walls, twisting amorphous, never quite solid. I clenched my fists, fighting through the fear that threatened to consume me. "I won't let you win," I hissed into the storm. The battle waged on a harrowing dance of light and darkness, memory and nightmare. My mind teetered on the edge, haunted by the possibility that I was losing not just the fight against the hollow presence, but my very grasp on reality. But Claire's voice, warm and steady, never faltered. It was a beacon cutting through the storm's fury, the static's malevolence. Minutes stretched like hours as I stood my ground, the radio a lifeline, the storm a raging battlefield. Then, slowly, the oppressive weight began to lift. The static softened, the shadows receded, and the room's temperature crept back to normal. The radio fell silent, the storm outside dwindling to a gentle rain. I sank to my knees, breath ragged, body trembling. The ordeal had left scars deeper than the eye could see, wounds etched in mind and soul. But for now, the hollow presence was pushed back, if only momentarily. Claire's final whisper lingered in the silence, a promise and a warning. "I'm with you, always." As the rain tapped softly against the window, I knew this was far from over. The veil between worlds had been crossed tonight, and though I had faced the darkness, it had marked me. The question gnawed at me how long before it returned, stronger and more relentless. And would I be ready? Yet, in the heart of that terrifying night, amidst the static and shadows, I found a sliver of hope. I was not alone. Claire's voice, fragile and enduring, was my anchor. And with it, I would fight to protect the living, to face the grief, and to cross the veil again if I had to. The battle for the town and my own soul was only beginning. The storm had reached its crescendo, a violent symphony of thunder and howling wind that rattled the very bones of the old radio station where I had staged my desperate stand. Every instinct screamed for me to flee, but I held my ground, clutching the makeshift talismans and equipment where'd cobbled together fragments of old technology and desperate hope. The static that had roared like a beast moments before suddenly cut to nothing, silence. The kind of silence that presses on your eardrums so heavily it's almost physical. I slumped against the cracked concrete wall, sweat mixing with rain and blood trickling from a gash on my forehead. My breath came in ragged gasps, chest heaving as the adrenaline ebbed away. For the first time in months, the oppressive presence that had haunted Metha, formless shadow that twisted memories and clawed at my sanity, felt like it had receded. Yet the silence was unnatural, as if the world itself held its breath. Back home, the radios were dead. No static hiss, no distant voices, no faint echo of Claire's fractured warnings. I sat in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by the silent machines, their dials frozen like tombstones, marking the boundary of a world I'd barely survived crossing. My hands trembled as I reached out to each, coaxing them as if willing them to speak. But only a hollow nothingness responded. The absence of sound was deafening. The memories came unbidden, sharp and jagged. Claire's voice, fragile and urgent, floating through the static like a ghostly melody. The look in her eyes when she warned me, fear wrapped in love, a desperate plea to hold on. I closed my eyes and tried to hold on to that moment, but the silence seemed to swallow it whole. A soft knock at the door startled me. Margaret and Eli stood there, their faces drawn and weary but alive with cautious hope. Margaret's sharp eyes searched mine as she stepped inside, the weight of unspoken understanding hanging between us. Eli, once the skeptic, now an uneasy believer, carried the same haunted look that had settled over me. We spoke in low tones, recounting the battle with the hollow presence, piecing together the fragmented truths we'd uncovered. The town outside lay silent. The storm passed, but the air still thick with tension. It was as if the world itself waited for the next move, the next ripple in a pond still trembling from a stone's throw. Night deepened, and I found myself alone once more, staring out the window into the darkness beyond. The silence pressed in around me, and for a fleeting moment, the shadows seemed to pulse, alive with a presence I couldn't see but could feel. I shivered, the memory of Claire's voice whispering just beyond reach, a haunting refrain that promised this was not the end. Had I truly pushed the hollow presence back, or had I merely silenced its voice for a time? The question gnawed at the edges of my mind as exhaustion claimed me, dragging me into a restless sleep haunted by echoes of static and shadow. In the quiet aftermath, the town seemed to breathe again, tentative and fragile. But beneath the surface, the weight of grief and fear lingered, a reminder that the boundary between life and death remained thin and perilous. And as the radios sat silent, I knew that some voices never truly fade. They wait, patient and eternal, in the hollow spaces between worlds. The night stretched on, and in that fragile silence, I faced the truth I had long avoided. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of statica, reminder that the hollow presence was not gone, only waiting, and I would be ready. The silence that had fallen over the town was unnatural in its depth, a void so complete it pressed on Tom's chest like a physical weight. The radios, once alive with static and spectral voices, now sat mute, their dials frozen in stillness. Yet, beneath this quiet, Tom felt a trembling unease, a subtle pulse that suggested the battle was far from over. He found himself standing before the familiar door of the town's library, its wooden frame weathered but sturdy, a beacon of knowledge and refuge. Margaret Lane greeted him with a nod, her sharp eyes reflecting the same cautious hope that Tom carried. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. the quiet only broken by the steady ticking of an old clock mounted on the far wall. "It's too quiet," Tom whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, almost like the calm before a storm. Margaret nodded slowly, pulling a worn volume from the shelf. "The silence isn't peace. It's waiting. The entity, whatever it truly is, has withdrawn, but its shadow lingers." They pored over the town's archives, seeking patterns and clues that might explain the hollow presence's sudden retreat and its persistent influence. Each record revealed stories of grief, loss, and strange disturbances echoing through the decade stories that now felt eerily connected to the recent events. Later, Tom visited Eli Jacobs in his cluttered radio studio. A faint, almost imperceptible crackle of static filled the room despite the radio's official silence. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the dials, eyes scanning the screens for any sign of the entity's return. "I thought it was over," Eli murmured, voice tense. "But this feels like a warning." Tom stood silently beside him, listening. The static was faint but persistent, like a whisper just beyond hearing. Days passed, and Tom found himself wandering the town's empty streets at dusk, the fading light casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with a life of their own. The cold wind carried faint echo-soft murmurs tangled with the rustling of dead leaves. He paused beneath a weathered sign, its creak slicing through the oppressive quiet, a reminder that the town was still alive, still vulnerable. In the small cafe where they had first shared coffee in the early days of his investigation, Tom, Margaret, and Eli met again. Voices were low, laden with the weight of what they knew and feared. "We need to be ready," Margaret said firmly. "The hollow presence feeds on grief and fear. If we can break that cycle, maybe we can weaken it." Tom nodded, the sorrow in his eyes tempered by a flicker of resolve. "I don't want to lose anyone else. Not to this, whatever it is." Eli added, "The radios might be quiet now, but the airwaves never truly sleep. We'll listen, always." As they spoke, the comforting aroma of coffee filled the room, a small but precious anchor to normalcy amid the lingering dread. Outside, the town began its slow, fragile recovery, but Tom knew the echoes of the hollow presence would haunt them for a long time to come. The silence was not the end, it was a pause, and in that pause, the shadows waited. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on the chest, making each breath feel like a labor. Tom sat alone, slumped in his worn armchair, the dim light of a single lamp casting trembling shadows across the walls. Before him, on the cracked wooden table, lay scattered photographs, snapshots of a life that once was, Claire's bright smile frozen in time, her eyes capturing a warmth that now seemed painfully distant. He reached out, fingers trembling, to touch one of the photos. It was an image taken on a summer's day, Claire laughing as sunlight dappled through the trees, her hair catching the breeze. Tom's throat tightened, a familiar ache blossoming in his chest. The radios were silent now. The voices that had once seeped through the static, the fractured warnings, the familiar tones, had all but vanished. Yet the silence was not peace. It was a void filled with restless memories and unspoken fears. Closing his eyes, Tom let the memories wash over him. He saw Claire's gentle smile, heard the soft cadence of her voice as she read to him during long nights when illness had claimed her strength. He remembered the way she would reach for his hand, offering comfort even when her own spirit faltered. The guilt gnawed at him, the helplessness of those final days, the whispered prayers unanswered. A sudden creak from the house stirred him. The wind rattled the window pane, carrying with it a chill that seeped under the door. He shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of absence. He opened his eyes and looked around the room, empty, save for the relics of a past life. The silence seemed to pulse, a living thing holding its breath, waiting. The following afternoon, a soft knock at the door pulled Tom from his reverie. Margaret Lane stood there, holding a bundle of aged papers tied with a faded ribbon. Her sharp eyes softened as she stepped inside, setting the documents carefully on the kitchen table. "I found these in the archives," she said quietly. "Letters, diaries, pieces of the town's past. There's more to this story, Tom, more than just the voices on the radio." Tom nodded, grateful for the company, for the distraction. Together, they spread the papers out, the afternoon sun filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow over their shared endeavor. As they sifted through faded ink and fragile pages, fragments of history came alive. Stories of loss, of inexplicable disappearances, of grief that clung to the very air of the town. "It's a cycle," Margaret murmured. "Grief feeding grief, the hollow presence. It's been here longer than we imagined." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of the revelation settling over him. His personal sorrow was but a thread in a tapestry of collective despair. Later that evening, Eli Jacobs stopped by. His usual casual demeanor was tempered by a newfound seriousness. He brought with him technical equipment and a quiet determination, a stark contrast to the skeptical radio host Tom had first met. "The static's gone," Eli said, setting down a small receiver, "but that doesn't mean it's over. Sometimes silence speaks the loudest." Tom glanced toward the silent radio sitting on the shelf. He hesitated, then reached out, fingers trembling as he switched it on. The dial clicked, but no crackle of static greeted him. Only profound, enveloping quiet. He sat back, heart pounding. The absence of sound was haunting in itself. Yet beneath that silence, he sensed a faint, almost imperceptible pulse, a whisper of Claire's distant echo, a fragile thread linking him to a past still unresolved. For hours Tom wrestled with his emotions, grief, hope, dread, tangled together like the static on the radios that once filled his nights. The journey toward healing felt tentative, like stepping onto thin ice, unsure if it would hold. As dawn crept through the blinds, Tom realized that while the voices had ceased, the presence lingered. The boundary between past and present, life and death, was fragile but enduring. He would carry the weight of loss with him, but perhaps now, for the first time in a long while, there was space to breathe, to remember without being consumed. Yet the quiet was uneasy, and the unanswered questions hung heavy in the air. What lay beyond the silence? Was the hollow presence truly vanquished, or merely waiting, watching, biding its time in the shadows? Tom's fingers traced the edge of a photograph once more, his gaze lifting to the window where the first light of morning promised a tentative hope. The journey was far from over, but for now, in this fragile moment between night and day, grief and healing, he allowed himself to hope. And somewhere beyond the veil of silence, Claire's voice lingered, a whisper, a warning, a promise. The radios remained silent, but the story was not finished. The night had settled deep and heavy around the town, swallowing the narrow streets and shuttered windows in a thick, velvety darkness. Tom sat alone in his living room, the only light a pale, flickering glow emanating from the ancient radio perched on the rickety table before him. The room was quiet except for the faint crackle of static, the soft hiss of white noise that had become a constant companion since the radios had fallen silent days ago. But tonight, the static carried something else, subtle, almost imperceptible whispers weaving through the air, like fragile threads of sound barely clinging to existence. Tom's breath caught. He leaned closer, eyes straining to pierce the dimness, fingers trembling as they hovered over the tuning dial. The voices were faint, fractured by static, but there, beneath the layered hiss, was a familiar cadence. It was Claire. Her voice, distant and ghostly, slipped through the air like a secret only he could hear. "Tom, be careful." The veil, still thin. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs, a mixture of hope and dread knotting inside his chest. For months, ever since the radio broadcasts had first begun, Tom had clung to the voices, the spectral warnings that had pulled him from numb grief into a desperate, obsessive quest. Now, as the night deepened, the whispers seemed to hum with a fragile persistence, as if the boundary between worlds trembled but had not yet sealed. The next day, Tom met Margaret at the town library, a sanctuary of faded books and dusty memories. The room smelled of old paper and quiet determination. Together, they sifted through brittle records and yellowed newspapers, searching for any clue that might explain the lingering echoes. As Tom placed his portable radio on the wooden table, a soft, trembling static filled the space, threading itself through the hushed rustle of pages turning. Margaret glanced up, her sharp eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "It's like the town itself is holding its breath," she said softly. "The grief, the loss, it's woven into everything here. Maybe that's what keeps the veil from closing completely." Tom nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. The diary they had uncovered weeks ago had revealed a cycle of sorrow and disappearance, a pattern that fed the hollow presence. Now, even in silence, the presence lingered, a shadow in the static, a whisper in the dark. Later, at Eli's cluttered radio station, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of machines and blinking lights. Eli, once a skeptic, now sat hunched over his equipment, adjusting dials with a focused intensity. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of meters and monitors, betrayed a mixture of unease and dawning belief. Suddenly, through the static, a faint voice threaded through, delicate, broken, unmistakably Claire's. Eli's breath caught, his fingers freezing on the controls. "Did you hear that?" he asked, voice low. "It's her, or something like her." The moment hung heavy, a fragile bridge between disbelief and something far darker. Eli's transformation from doubt to uneasy acceptance mirrored Tom's own journey, a reluctant acknowledgement that the hollow presence was not gone, merely waiting. As dawn crept over the horizon, Tom stood by his window, the town shrouded in mist and silence. The radio sat dormant beside him, but in the stillness, faint voices drifted on the morning breeze, ethereal and trembling. He closed his eyes, listening to the fragile whispers, the echoes of Claire's voice threading through the quiet. The boundary between worlds was still fragile, still porous, and though the immediate threat had receded, the haunting persisted, a lingering echo of grief. A whispered warning that the darkness waiting beyond was never far away. Tom's resolve hardened. He would keep listening, keep watching. For Claire, for the town, and for the fragile hope that even in loss, some connection remained, a thread of light through the static, a whisper against the silence. The voices were fading, but they were not gone. The hollow presence still stirred, and Tom knew the battle was far from over. He reached out, fingers brushing the radio's cold surface, and whispered into the quiet, "I'm still here." Outside, the mist shifted, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible reply. The night was not silent. Not yet. The dim light of the library's basement flickered uncertainly. casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with the whispers of the past. Dust motes floated lazily in the stale air, disturbed only by the soft rustling of old pages being turned. Margaret Lane's hands trembled slightly as she finally pulled open the ancient ledger she had discovered, hidden behind a false panel in the back wall. The book's leather cover was cracked and faded, the spine worn thin from decades, perhaps centuries of neglect. Tom stood close behind her, his breath shallow, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The scent of old paper and mildew filled his nostrils, a sensory reminder of how deeply buried the town's darkest secrets had become. He leaned in, squinting to catch the faded ink and looping script, trying to decipher the archaic handwriting that chronicled events long forgotten. This isn't just a record of events," Margaret murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a ledger of sacrifices, rituals, and warnings. The town's founders, some of them, anyway, were aware of the darkness lurking beneath the surface. They tried to contain it, to keep it from spilling into our world. But their attempts failed." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. Failed how? Margaret traced a finger along the page, stopping at a passage that described a clandestine society known only as the Keepers. They had attempted to harness the collective grief of the townspeople, believing that by channeling sorrow and loss into ritual, they could seal away the malevolent force that now haunted their radios. But instead of banishing the darkness, their efforts had only fed it, strengthening the hollow presence that had slipped through the cracks between life and death. "It's a cycle," she said, her eyes meeting Tom's. "Every death, every moment of grief, every unanswered plight gives the hollow presence more power. And the more powerful it becomes, the harder it is to resist." Tom felt a cold shiver ripple down his spine, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together with a terrifying clarity. The entity wasn't just some random supernatural force. It was a living, growing manifestation of the town's pain and sorrow, an ancient predator awakened and nourished by human anguish. As Margaret continued to read, the storm outside began to grow, thunder rolling softly in the distance and a chill creeping through the basement's cracked walls. The flickering light above them struggled against the gathering darkness, as if the very air was charged with an ominous energy. "We've been fighting a losing battle," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But now that we know the truth, maybe we can find a way to break the cycle." Margaret nodded slowly, closing the ledger with a decisive snap. "It won't be easy. The history is full of failed attempts, and each time the hollow presence grows stronger. But understanding its nature is the first step." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with bruised shades of orange and purple, Tom and Margaret found themselves standing in the fading light of the old town square. The bare branches of the trees stretched out like skeletal hands against the darkening sky, and the silence between them was heavy with the weight of their discovery. "The hollow presence feeds on grief," Margaret said softly, her breath visible in the cooling air. "That means if we can find a way to heal, to let go, we might starve it. But how?" Tom asked, his voice cracking. "How do you make a town forget its pain?" "You don't," she replied. "You face it. You confront the sorrow, the fear, the loss together. Otherwise, it will keep coming back." Tom's gaze drifted to the quiet streets, the homes dark and still, as if holding their breath. The radios were silent now, but the absence of sound was no comfort. He knew the peace was fragile, a temporary lull in a storm that was far from over. Back in Margaret's study, the room was cluttered with notes, newspaper clippings, and the ledger now resting unopened on the desk. The faint hum of the town settled outside the window, the quiet punctuated only by the distant call of a night bird. Tom stared out at the streetlights, their halos blurred by a thin mist rising from the ground. The radio sat silent on the desk, its dials frozen, its speaker mute. Yet Tom felt the restless echo of voices in the stillness, the faintest trace of Claire's voice lingering at the edge of hearing. The knowledge they had uncovered both comforted and terrified him. The battle was no longer just about saving himself or his town, it was about breaking a cycle that had bound generations in sorrow and darkness. As the night deepened, Tom's thoughts spiraled through memories and possibilities, fears and hopes. The weight of the town's secrets settled on his shoulders, heavy but not unbearable. He was no longer alone in this fight. Margaret's calm presence, her fierce determination, gave him a sliver of light in the encroaching shadows. But the question remained, how to confront a force that thrived on grief itself. How to sever the tether that bound the living to the dead, to the hollow presence and its insatiable hunger. Tom's fingers brushed the edge of the radio, cold and still. Somewhere beyond the veil, he imagined Claire's voice calling to him, urging him onward. The road ahead was uncertain and perilous, but he had to walk it, for her, for the town, for himself. And as the first drops of rain began to patter against the window pane, the silence held its breath, waiting for the next move in a game that had been played for far too long. The secret was out. Now, the real fight could begin. The shadows had begun to seep into my waking hours, no longer content to lurk at the edges of night. They whispered, stretched, and twisted in ways that made the familiar world feel perilously strange. I would sit in the quiet of my living room, the old radio crackling with its usual static, and feel the air thick and thick with some unseen presence that bent light and sound around it. It was as if the very fabric of reality had loosened, and in the gaps, the hollow presence prowled. I could no longer tell when I was truly alone. The lines between memory and hallucination blurred. Sometimes I saw Claire's face in the flickering shadows cast by street lamps, her soft smile both a balm and a torment. Other times, her voice came through the radio, fractured and distant, calling my name with a tenderness that shattered my resolve. Each morning, I woke to a world that felt less real, the colors muted, sounds muffled as if filtered through a veil. The townsfolk seemed to notice the change too. Margaret, ever the steady anchor, met me in the library one overcast afternoon. Her sharp eyes softened with concern as I recounted the growing disturbances in my perception. The historical records we pored over took on new weight. Each tragedy, each disappearance, a thread in the tapestry of sorrow that fed the entity lurking in our midst. Tom, Margaret said quietly, you're carrying more than just grief. This entity, whatever it is, it feeds on the cracks in our reality. We have to find a way to seal those cracks before it consumes more of us. Eli, once a skeptic, had become an uneasy believer. His technical expertise was invaluable, but even he admitted the limits of science in explaining the phenomena. The radios sometimes emitted bursts of static that defied explanation, voices layering over each other in a cacophony of despair and warning. One evening, walking home beneath a bruised sky, the streetlights flickered and the shadows lengthened unnaturally. The silence between sounds stretched taut until I thought it might snap. A faint chorus of voices drifted on the wind, indistinct but unmistakably human. I quickened my pace, the sense of being watched prickling my skin. Back inside, the radio crackled to life without warning. Claire's voice emerged from the static, a fragile thread of sound that wove through the chaos. Tom, she whispered, the veil thins. Beware the shadows that hunger. A cold breath from the darkness brushed my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw only the familiar outlines of my home distorted by the moonlight. Yet the feeling lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. Sleep became a battleground. Dreams and waking moments collided in a disorienting dance. Faces from the past appeared in the periphery of vision. Voices echoed from empty rooms, and the radio's static was a constant companion. I found myself talking aloud to the empty air, desperate for a response that never came. Despite the torment, a stubborn flame of determination burned within me. The town needed protection, and I was the only one who had glimpsed the true extent of the threat. But the cost was high. My mind frayed at the edges, each day a struggle to hold on to sanity. Margaret and Eli became my lifeline anchors to the world I feared slipping away. We continued our research, seeking patterns, signs, anything that would give us an edge against the encroaching darkness. The diary entries revealed cycles of grief and loss that fed the entity, a parasitic force thriving on sorrow. "It's not just about stopping it," Eli said one night, eyes weary from hours of monitoring the radios. "We have to understand it." Understanding felt like chasing shadows, but it was all we had. As days passed, the line between protector and victim blurred. The hollow presence was no longer a distant threat. It was entwined with every breath I took, every shadow that flickered at the edge of vision. And yet, in the depths of the static, Claire's voice remained an anchor in the storm. Her warnings grew more urgent, a reminder that the battle was far from over. I steeled myself for the unknown, aware that the shadows were watching, waiting for me to falter. The unseen shadows had become a part of me, and the question was no longer if I would break, but when. Until then, I would fight. For Claire, for the town, for the fragile line between life and death that I was sworn to guard. But as I lay awake, the radio silent for a rare moment, I wondered if the line was already gone, and if the darkness had claimed me long ago. The night stretched on, thick with possibility and peril. Somewhere beyond the veil, the hollow presence waited. And so did I. The shadows were no longer just around me, they were inside me. The night was unusually still, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. Tom sat motionless in his dimly lit living room, the weight of months of grief and fear settling like a stone in his chest. His fingers rested lightly on the worn radio's dial, a device that had become both his tether and his torment since Claire's death. Tonight, the static had been louder than usual, a relentless hiss that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity. Then, through the crackling interference, a voice emerged, faint, yet unmistakably hers. "Tom, listen carefully." Claire's voice whispered, fragile but urgent. "The boundary, it's breaking again. You must be ready, it's not over." The room seemed to shrink around him, shadows stretching and contracting as if breathing with the warning. Tom's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every fiber of his being screamed to reach out, to respond, but all he could do was listen. The voice faded, swallowed by static once more, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. He leaned back, eyes closed, the echo of her words reverberating in his mind. This was no longer just a message from beyond. It was a summons, a final plea that he could not ignore. The fragile barrier between worlds, so easily disturbed by grief and fear, was weakening once again, and this time the consequences would be dire. Morning found Tom at the local library, seated across from Margaret and Eli in the cramped back room where town records and radio equipment cluttered every surface. Margaret's sharp eyes scanned the brittle, yellowed diary, her fingers tracing faded entries that spoke of past tragedies eerily similar to their own. Eli, headphones around his neck, adjusted dials and checked frequencies, his skepticism replaced by a cautious belief. "It's happening again," Margaret said quietly, her voice tinged with worry. "The cycle repeats. The hollow presence feeds on grief, and the town's sorrow only makes it stronger." Eli nodded, tapping a few keys on his laptop. "If Claire's warning is true, we need to understand how to contain it, or at least prepare for what's coming." Tom listened, absorbing their words like a man bracing for a storm. The knowledge was a double-edged sword, comforting in its clarity, terrifying in its implications. He realized that his role was no longer just about seeking answers or clinging to memories. He was now a guardian, a barrier between the living and the encroaching darkness. That evening, Tom wandered the mist-laden streets of the town, the cold air biting at his skin, his breath forming small clouds in the fading light. The familiar silence of the sleeping town was broken only by a distant crackle-an errant radio signal, flickering through the fog like a ghostly heartbeat. Each step Tom took felt weighted, as though the ground beneath him trembled with unseen forces. He stopped beneath a flickering street lamp and closed his eyes, recalling Claire's voice, the urgency in her tone. The pain of loss was still raw, but beneath it now lay a steely resolve. He was no longer just a broken man haunted by memories. He was a sentinel standing watch at the fragile boundary between two worlds. Returning home, Tom sat once more by the radio. The device, silent for hours, suddenly burst to life with a burst of static before Claire's voice returned, clearer than before. "Remember, Tom," she said softly, "the line is thin. Protect those you love. Do not let the darkness cross." And then, silence. The radio fell into an oppressive quiet, leaving Tom alone with the weight of the moment. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Yet within him burned a cautious hope, a determination forged from grief and love. The fight was far from over. As he stared into the darkness, Tom knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where he must confront not only the hollow presence, but also the depths of his own fear and sorrow. The final warning had been given, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The radios may be silent now, but the echoes of the past and the promise of the future hummed quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment they would rise again. The boundary was fragile, but Tom Harper was no longer a man broken by loss. He was a guardian standing watch alone, haunted but unyielding, and the night held its breath. The old radio sat in the corner of the living room, its wooden casing dulled by years of neglect, the dial glowing faintly in the shadows. Tom Harper had not paid it much mind since Claire's passing 6 months ago. It had become little more than a relic, a background fixture in the hollow silence that filled the house. But that night, the static that usually accompanied his restless nights took on a different quality. He was drawn to it, his fingers twitching with an urgency he could neither understand nor resist. The air hummed with an uneasy energy as he turned the dial slowly, the needle jittering erratically across the frequency band. At first, there was nothing but the familiar hiss and crackle of white noise, a sound that had become strangely comforting in its constancy. But then, beneath the static, a voice emerged, a voice so faint it might have been imagined, yet unmistakable in its timbre. "Tom," it whispered, fragile as a breath, yet piercing the stillness like a shard of glass. His heart seized, breath caught in his throat. The voice was hers, Claire, closer than memory, yet fractured as if carried through a veil of static and distance. "They're coming. You must be ready." He froze, every rational thought fleeing in the wake of that tender, haunting sound. His hands trembled as he reached to adjust the dial, desperate to clear the interference, to hear her more clearly. But the voice slipped away, swallowed once more by the crackling abyss. Questions flooded his mind. Was it grief, a cruel trick conjured by his longing? Or something else, something beyond the veil that separated life from death? The room seemed to grow colder, shadows crawling along the walls, as if alive, listening. Tom sat back, eyes fixed on the radio's glowing dial, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The town outside was quiet, but he felt it, this shift in the air, the subtle undercurrent of something waiting, watching. The static had become a language, and Claire's voice was its first word. That night marked a turning point. The fragile whisper from beyond the grave ignited a desperate hope within him, pulling him from the depths of his sorrow and into a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, and the radio's whispered secrets no one was meant to hear. He was no longer alone, but the warning lingered. They were coming, and he had no idea what it meant. As he sat in the dark, the static whispered on, carrying voices both familiar and unknown, weaving a tapestry of grief, dread, and the faintest glimmer of hope. His journey had begun.